So for this part, we're going to continue looking at the loaner book table. So when we talked last time, it was about, hey, how do we make sure that we can have the same loaner check out multiple books? How can we have multiple people checking out multiple books? And how do we represent all of that inside of the database? So we started out by creating a loaner book table that acts as a many-to-many table relationship. But we still have a lot of questions that we still need to answer. Things like, when was the book checked out? How do we address that? Well, inside of this many-to-many table, we can track specific things about the relationship between the loaner and that book. So we can add additional columns here, such as checkout date. That would be a date time too. Then we can have problems like, well, when is the book due back? So we could say book due and set that as another date time too. So from here now, when that book is, thinking about the software front end for this database, when that book comes through and we scan the book, we just capture the date that that scan was made, and then maybe we talk about establishing what are the rules for checking out books. So we establish some rules and say books get checked out for 2 weeks, and then we would calculate 2 weeks out from the checkout date, and then we would store that due date in the book due column. Another problem is this book currently checked out or has it been returned? So you run into situations on probably both ends of the spectrum where someone checks out a book, they finish it before the 2 weeks, and they bring the book back. Well, how do you know if the book has been returned? Same thing is, what if they neglect to bring the book back and they're past their due date? How do you know that the book is still out? So to do that, we can put a column, and this again is preference, but an is active column. And we'll make this column a bit type. And the bit type can be used to represent booleans or yes or no or true or false or off or on. And we can set that. Now, the is active will then tell us if the book is currently out for loan, then is active will be set to true. If the book is in returned, we'll set it to false, and that means that the book has been returned. So that'll be our mechanism for actually tracking if the book has been returned or not. So talk through a scenario. Person comes up, they have one book. We would then look up that person by their library card number, find their loaner ID inside the database, and we would store that. We would find their book by Dewey Decimal, ISBN, or maybe it has a book ID that's unique. We would take that and we would store that as the book ID. We would then go and we would say today's date is X date, and we would store that in the checkout date. We would look at the loaning policy and say these books are checked out for 2 weeks, and then we would store the date 2 weeks ahead in the book due column, and then we would flag it as active for true, or set a 1 in that bit field. So at this point, that book has now, quote unquote, been checked out. We've logged it. We have that data in our database, and we're able to then say, we have data and we've loaned out this book to user A. So that would be the construct that we would go with this table design. So we'll go ahead and save that. And now let's go ahead and populate our tables with a little bit of data to see how all this would work in a real world scenario. So I'm going to right click on books, and I'm going to choose edit top 200 rows. What that does is it gives me an entry point to type in and create new books. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back into my PowerPoint for a moment. I'm going to steal some fake book data. So let's zoom out and bring this side by side again. And let's go ahead and we'll just steal some of this data here. Now actually I should start with the author data because I'm going to end up with a foreign key issue. So I'm going to go with authors, right click, edit top 200, and Susan was the author of this book. And I'll just make up a birthday. And the publisher, I think we do have publisher information here. And we'll store that. So by walking away from that row, clicking down below, it saved that row to the database, and it added the number 1 as the primary key, just in our in our dummy data. So if I jump back to books, my author ID for this book will be 1. ISBN will be this. Page count is 40. I don't know the Dewey Decimal. The publisher, whoops, again is G.P. Putnam. Topics, I don't know, but I'm going to go ahead and put children's. And then for our copyright will be 9/13/2016. So we've now created a row for our book. Now just to kind of give you some clarity to this, we can bring up a new query window just as we would, and we can say select all from books, hit execute, and there's our book row. Just the same, we can join authors on books.authorid equals authors.id, and that will bring back the book and the author, just like in our demo data. So now we can actually see how our data would work and function in the real world. So now we want to go ahead and check out a book. So first thing we need is a loaner. So I'm actually going to create a loaner. I'm going to do it inside of a query window. So I'm going to do an insert into loaners, or loaner. And I'm going to set the columns of first name, last name, address, age, birth date, education, gender. I'm going to actually jump back here. And we're going to have library card number. And the order is really preference. It doesn't have to do with anything. And then, so those are going to be our columns to insert into. And then our values will be me. Just give myself a fake card number. And then we'll set the birth date to and education. Yes. No, that's not actually what we're looking for, but I'm just being silly. Male, and then 513. And then we'll create a phone number. Alright, so now we should be able to execute this query, do an insert into the loaner table with these values. We'll hit execute. It says 1 row affected. So now if we go back and we do select star from loaner, that'll bring up our loaner record. So now we need to insert into loaner book. So if we query that right now, it's completely empty. So we'll go ahead and do an insert into loaner book. So we'll insert into loaner book, and the values will be loaner ID, book ID, checkout date, book due date, and is active. So the values, and this is pretty easy because right now we know our loaner. Oh, we need to look it up. So select all from loaner, and we're going to do also a select all from book. And we'll select both of those. I'm highlighting them, and then I'm going to execute up here. And I'm going to pull back both those rows so I can look at their IDs. So my loaner ID is 1, my book ID is 1. Makes it pretty simple. My checkout date will be today's date, so I'm just going to call get date. And then my book due date will be get date plus 14, 2 weeks. And then my is active will be 1. So from there I should be able to run this query and do a select, and that will provide me with the data needed. So now at this point I've now checked out the Water Princess, and I checked it out today, and it's due back in 2 weeks. And that checkout is currently marked as active. So now I've actively checked out a library book. So if I come and I actually return that book, and I return it early, I can come back then and in my software, quote unquote, I return the book gets checked back in, and then we'll update loaner book. And we'll set the is active equal to 0, where the book ID is equal to 1. And the way that this is working for us is that because each book would have its own unique ID, when that book comes back in, we would know that book's unique ID, and we could just look up by that ID and set the isActive to 1. Now to clarify further, we could say and isActive equals 1, and then we'll ensure that we're only updating the record that is currently active. So we'll run that, F5, and now that book has now been returned. So now we've established that relationship. We are now able to loan out to multiple loaners. We're able to loan them multiple books. We know when the books are checked out. We know when the books are due back. And we know which books have been returned versus still being out. So we've established a pretty good many-to-many relationship that represents the book, the author, and its loaner. So hopefully that gives you some insight into how to construct many-to-many relationships. We'll be exploring this much more in later weeks, but just to kind of get you up to speed and make sure that you're thinking that way and seeing how that all works together, that was really the goal of this lecture.